What a turnaround, right? From April, there was just this huge amount of turbulence and turmoil in the markets. I think people just got used to the idea of uncertainty, and companies said, hey, well, we still see an advantage to getting bigger, to merging, to scaling up.
Markets thrive on volatility, and that seems to be the norm, right?
The resilience of the economy has been very, very surprising and super interesting in the context of all of these unusual events that are happening. Really, all businesses that are driven by people are centered in the capacity of the people who work in them to drive change, to set the tone, to set culture. AIs don't get scoops, and I imagine AIs don't get deals either.
What's your take on what this year's market might mean for those who are looking for a new role, and how might they navigate that?
So
I am so excited about my guest today, Lananh Nguyen, lead U.S. finance editor at Reuters. Lananh's background and expertise is in covering investment banks, so naturally, that is our primary topic today. We discuss the state of affairs of 2025 in financial services and how the markets have shown surprisingly strong resilience in a year of tariffs and geopolitical chaos. We also chat through recent bank earnings and why trading is outpacing M&A at this point in the year. Lastly, we touch on talent and what this type of market means for anyone currently on the job market or considering making a move. Hi, Lananh. Thank you so much for being here today.
thank you, Jesse. It's great to be with you.
How does a financial services journalist do their job? How do you become a market expert and the trusted source of information to so many in the industry? Because the reason you're here is because you've been in my inbox. I've read articles by you and was like, that's somebody I want to speak with. So how did you get to where you are?
Well, thanks, Jesse. I mean, there's no magic to it. I studied political science in college. I always wanted to be a journalist. I got my first, kind of job in journalism after a few internships in college. I got a cold call job at recruit@dowjones.com and, got the most junior job in the newsroom, editing a newsletter, networked, made my way around the newsroom and eventually got a job as a markets reporter in London covering energy markets. And from there, it's just shoe leather. It's talking to people, learning the beat, writing stories, gaining credibility, and over time, gaining credibility in your subject and then looking up further afield. So I was in London, decided to move to Bloomberg to cover energy, and then wanted to move to the US. Ended up moving to the US to cover foreign exchange markets and then banking. And here we are today. Fast forward to today, I cover the biggest US banks and Wall Street operations as well as consumer banking. So it's just, little by little over time, you develop expertise.
I commend you and thank you for the information and resources that you've provided me and the financial services industry previously. So I think with that, this is why you're here, is because we want to get your take on the state of affairs and what's going on in financial services at the moment. So, most recently, we obviously just had bank earnings a couple of weeks ago. For the most part, pretty positive. It seems to me that markets remain resilient, or the market remains resilient, and banks remain resilient and positive this year. Generally, what's your take on how the banks have performed in this whirlwind of and this chaos of 2025 so far?
Exactly. What a turnaround, right? From April, there was just this huge amount of turbulence and turmoil in the markets after Donald Trump announced all of those tariffs, and everyone kind of really froze up. Market activity really froze up. Companies got very, very uncertain and nervous. Nobody wanted to do anything, no deals, no transactions, etc. And then suddenly, I think people just got used to the idea of uncertainty, and companies said, hey, well, we still see an advantage to getting bigger, to merging, to scaling up, to getting more customers, or buying AI capacities, sorting out our supply chains. And so there was a real sort of thaw in that sentiment and an improvement in sentiment that really pushed activity to a rebound in the second half of the second quarter. So a lot of the banks, including the biggest banks, reported a pretty decent rebound in their investment banking activity after an early chill in the quarter. So most of the big banks really beat expectations on profits. And of course, their trading desks made out very well because of this huge gusher of activity in the markets. Markets whipsawing back and forth, up and down, and eventually, rising to the levels that we see today.
In a line, I think the new adage, the new old adage is markets thrive on volatility. And that seems to be the norm, right? The volatility has driven the activity that has turned this year's market into actually a successful one. And I want to talk a little bit more about that trading boom that you just referenced, right? I think that was kind of the highlight of everyone who shared positive earnings, especially the big banks and the leaders in industry. Their trading desks far outperformed M&A and investment banking revenues. What's your take and your view, as to why trading is doing better than banking at the moment?
Yeah, there's this notion of volatility really helping with trading. And so,
Mhm.
we obviously saw huge amounts of volatility this year in the markets. And so that has really, spurred activity because when markets are volatile, clients reposition their portfolios. They hedge, they take positions, they tactically trade. And so there was a huge amount of that going on in the first and second quarters. And so that has really benefited the trading desks. At the same time, the investment banking part of this was slower to materialize because, transactions take longer to cook, as one banker told me this week. It takes much longer for the CEOs to sort of get together, for them to do the numbers, and for a deal to work out, and for them to have some certainty or confidence that regulators will approve things. So, yeah, I think trading has done extremely well. It remains to be seen if that's going to continue for the rest of the year because I think people are getting more comfortable with the idea of uncertainty. So there isn't as much of that kind of whipsaw effect.
Are there other dynamics that you've seen in your career that exist this year that are at play in this financial market, or maybe things that are more ephemeral and present to this year specifically that are making this year unique? What's your take on that?
Well, it's interesting. As a poli-sci geek, I think probably, one thing that really makes me sit up is just the amount of geopolitical tension and conflict that's happening in the world right now. And actually, how markets have really shaken a lot of that off, right? If you told me, 5 years ago that there would be a war in Europe and that, there would be attacks on Iran, and markets would still kind of be shaking that off, I would be very, very surprised because, these things do have real world impacts. For instance, like Ukraine and Russia has an impact on the commodities market and wheat exports.
Most definitely.
Same with the Middle East and oil exports, which is a
Oil.
market that
Yep.
I grew up covering. So the fact that markets are still pretty sanguine right now is very interesting to me, as is the tariff impact. I know that the tariffs have not been fully implemented yet, so we don't know what the impact is going to be on prices, on consumer prices and goods prices. But so far, the shelves are still full. Prices have not soared in a way that's stopping people from, buying things in a big way. So I think the resilience of the economy has been very, very surprising and super interesting in the context of all of these unusual events that are happening.
It seems like in every article I read last year, the term soft landing and trying to navigate the soft landing. And it's not, I barely hear about a soft landing anymore, right? I think we're just there. I know we both studied political science, but we won't get into actual politics today. I know the president has his thoughts on the Fed chair, and I won't give my specific thoughts on if I think he's doing a good job. But the fact that the soft landing conversation, or what kind of landing we're going to be in, is at least in my world, barely even a topic. And all we're talking about is how markets are resilient and driving through volatility and thriving on volatility. I think that kind of defines that. I think that's a really interesting point you made, that they've just kind of shrugged off whatever geopolitical and sociopolitical elements are out there. We're just kind of living in it. And to me, I just find that to be really, really new. That hasn't happened as much. What are you hearing from your contacts in the market? Obviously, you speak with people at all levels in various divisions, various lines of business. Are most people in agreement with kind of this theme that you and I are talking about right now, the resilience, and are they happy? Are they concerned? What are you hearing more generally?
Yeah, it's interesting. And you mentioned the Fed chair point. A lot of bank CEOs last week actually did come out and say Fed independence is super important, right? So that's one long-term driver in the US that has obviously propped up our markets, is this sense of an independent central bank. So they definitely did underscore that. So that's something in my world that we covered, including the CEO of JP Morgan and others. But in
Hmm.
terms of what I'm hearing, it's really, really interesting. After earnings, what I heard from the earnings from banks talking to the media, either media or analysts, is that really things look very good going into the second half of the year. That soft landing that you talked about, it's almost like there's no landing, right? There's no
Exactly.
everything is very, consumers are healthy, businesses are healthy, everyone is looking at tariffs, but no one has had like a real disaster yet with regard to tariffs. And so it seemed pretty steady going from here, but obviously everyone is looking at the potential storm clouds that could be on the horizon, but they're definitely not here yet. And so there's this sense of optimism that's coming through from my contacts in the market, both on the consumer side and also on the wholesale sort of investment banking side of things. And of course, trading has been doing well, so that's still pretty bullish.
The consumer side, and consumer price index and spending, I always find that to be interesting because, you can read one article that talks about concerns, with the consumer price index and how it means that inflation might be at play, and then the next article will be about how many Americans are traveling and how much they're spending. In your mind, how does that work? Like, are Americans also resilient? Are we, as a population that helps drive markets and as retail investors, are we playing a large part in this resilience of the markets, or is it primarily institutional based?
I think it's both. And I do think that there is some discussion around sort of meme stocks getting exciting and interesting again, but
Yeah,
that's still very
especially
nascent.
this week. Hmm.
Exactly. However, I think in general, post pandemic, there was a lot of stimulus, and throughout the post pandemic period, people have been really surprised at how well consumers have held up in terms of paying back their bills, not getting more deeply indebted. And the thing that's very interesting, and is also kind of political, is that despite the aggregate numbers showing that the economy is doing extremely well, that people are employed, they are making money, and they're able to pay back their bills, everyone is really, really annoyed about the cost of living and rising costs of goods, eggs, etc. Right? So there
Yes.
is this disjunction, I think, between consumer sentiment and feeling about the costs of things and the actual sort of aggregate cost, right? So when I go to the supermarket, I'm annoyed about the high price of eggs, right? But in general, I think my standard of living and my finances have not dropped in the way that is kind of reflected in the sort of widespread discontent that we see in politics, right? And so that I think is a really, really interesting issue that cuts across, what I cover, which is banks and also just human
Yes.
beings and how they're living.
Totally fair. Totally fair. That's an interesting insight. I know we hadn't discussed that one previously, but you just mentioned the consumer side, and I thought I have you on the podcast. Might as well ask it to get your take. So I do want to pivot just a little bit and address. This was actually a specific line that I think you mentioned the last time we spoke, and it just stood out to me, and I want to get your take because I think there's a couple different ways we can digest this or break this down. You mentioned that Wall Street can seem technical and esoteric at times, but at the end of the day, it's a people business and it's driven by decision making. The two ways that I bifurcate that are, number one, your experience dealing with senior leaders and given what your Rolodex look like and how they conduct their business, obviously as people leading people and institutions employed by people, and the decision making aspect that's driven by that. That's number one. Second is more regarding the ubiquity of artificial intelligence and just AI in an ever-changing world, especially in financial services. I think I just said a lot there. If you want me to repeat anything or anything like that, but I do want to get your take on just that quote that you said. How Wall Street is esoteric and technical at times, but really it's a people business.
Yeah, I think all businesses right now, at least, are people businesses. And you and I talked
Of
about the
course.
parallels between recruitment and journalism. But
Yeah.
really, all businesses that are driven by people are centered in the capacity of the people who work in them to drive change, to set the tone, to set culture, and to drive those technical skills, right? So when I deal with bank CEOs or with senior leaders who run divisions, they are always talking about excellence in whatever they're doing. They're always talking about culture and driving good culture so that you have people who work hard, trust each other, work as a team, and don't try to stab each other in the back. And all of these kind of very, very human dynamics that exist and kind of underpin anything that gets super technical, right? Anything that gets super fancy, esoteric, you know, trading businesses where things trade faster than the blink of an eye and all this technology. Like
Literally.
ultimately what comes down to is the people who lead the businesses driving good performance through the ways that they select, right? And most of the time it's people who are highly technically skilled, but also really motivated, really driven, highly competitive, and also have an exhaustive curiosity and knowledge. And often the ones that are the best at these things also are extremely good with people, right? As you know in your business, right? The top leaders are the ones who can really resonate with a lot of people, who can give clear messages, who can inspire people to do better work and to, kind of level up at work, right? Like a CEO is not going to be able to talk to all 200,000 employees of his company, but he needs to be able to drive good performance just based on the tone he sets, right? So mostly he. So
Mostly.
that's a huge part of what I observe when I watch, CEOs or division heads or even small group leaders is that willingness to sort of try and inspire and energize people towards greater excellence.
So I listened to Masters in Business with Barry Ritholtz, who you may or may not know personally from your time at Bloomberg. And one day, this Searching Smarter podcast will be streaming just as much as that. Uh, and obviously, a lot of his guests are Wall Street leaders, right? And they say so many of the same things that you just mentioned. It doesn't need to be, as you say, technical and esoteric and about the high frequency with which you're making your trades. It's about you hire people, right? This is a hiring business. We work in a hiring business. You hire human beings and you evaluate them for why you think they're a fit on your team. And ultimately, it is maybe not as much down the road. Right now, it is the humans making the decisions, right? And it is the humans who are driving, leading these deals or choosing how to evaluate the volatility on the trading side that we just talked about. So yeah, I just wanted to get your take on the podcast about it because I thought that was a really interesting line. So I think maybe just our last little conversation, as I mentioned, it is a talent related podcast, Selby Jennings being financial services recruitment. We've talked a lot about the state of affairs of 2025 and where markets are at the moment. If you are speaking to a candidate or if you're addressing anyone who might be hiring at the moment, what's your take on what this year's market might mean for those who are either considering dipping their toes in the market, the candidate market, or have been looking for a new role, and how might they navigate that, just given all of the chaos that we've endured so far this year?
Yeah, I think it's kind of a busier summer just because maybe people put some ice on some of their hiring plans earlier this year just because of the, tumult that we were seeing in markets. So it may be a more active summer. I've certainly been covering a lot more people moves than I previously would during July. So that's just an anecdotal indicator from my team. A lot of MDs or heads of business. But, it's funny, these conversations, whether it's with candidates in journalism or I think candidates in financial services, they always come down to the basics, right? How hungry are you? How willing are you to learn? How driven are you to, reach a standard of excellence? And that goes for a junior analyst all the way up to a senior MD or business head, right? So I think as a people business, I think it's really, really important that candidates across all levels are burnishing their skills, are not taking shortcuts, are not, using AI to do things that then they don't learn how to do, right? So I say this all the time in journalism. I say AIs don't get scoops. And I imagine, AIs don't get deals either, right? So you can have an AI write a document for you in financial services, but you can't have it talk to a CEO and shake the hand of another CEO, right? So those things are still essential skills. The people skills and the soft skills, or what we call soft skills, are actually still so important and also very hard to learn and can only be learned over time, over practice. And, in your business, probably cold calling, same as mine, right? You got to get comfortable with
Absolutely.
talking to strangers, cold calling, the contact sport, as you say. There's no substitute for that. And I think it's still very, very essential. So that's something I would stress to candidates across all levels.
Absolutely. I completely agree. So wonderful. So thank you. Thank you for all of your insights today. I know you have so much more to add, and I know you have so many great perspectives and insights. I certainly look forward to reading the next 2 or 3 articles that you write that will be in my inbox. So just before I let you go, is there a most memorable interview or like soundbite that you've had that's kind of either shaped your career, or an interview that has really helped you understand the financial services market?
The interview I did with Bank of America CEO Brian Moynihan, who is still the CEO right now, was a really interesting one because he's a little bit of a lower key leader in financial services. He's not as bombastic as maybe some of the other personalities you've seen, and so I think that was a fun one because it was a quieter study of someone who is just not as not as showy as your typical sort of Wall Street guy. And the interesting thing is, I asked him about his tenure. He'd been in the seat for a long time, and there were questions around his succession. And he said, there's no power to consolidate. I was CEO then and I'm CEO now. Right. And so there was a little bit of a pithy quote at the end of the story that I thought, okay, so, you may have a kind of low key personality, but, there is still this kind of sense of strength and steel behind the
Yes.
person. And so, yeah, I love stories that can kind of get at how people tick, what makes them tick. And so that one was a really fun one to work on because it kind of gave me a deep dive into a particular individual who has had a really interesting career.
Love it. Love it. And what about books? So do you mostly read financial services? Do you stick to your studies, and are you reading about politics? What kind of books have you read? Do you like that the audience might like as well?
So I like, and at the moment I'm trying to read classics, right? Because I feel that
Okay.
maybe I didn't read as many classics as I should have when I was studying poli-sci. I read, required readings, but I recently read The Prince by Machiavelli, which probably I shouldn't admit to because I probably should have read it a long time ago. But those classic texts. I also recently revisited the Federalist Papers, which
James Madison, of course,
yes, which
classic,
are classic, but
foundation of this
also
country.
completely foundational for this country, but also very, very live today. I think anyone going back to those papers will see that some of those discussions, those existential questions about our nation are still very much in play, especially right now as things are changing, right? So, I definitely don't see those as kind of antiquated, ancient books. I think that, Federalist Papers are very, very much live issues that are really resonant and relevant today.
I love that. And I think that's not by coincidence.
Mhm.
Right? That's how they founded democracy. And if I get going, then you and I are going to be on here for another hour and a half. So what about podcasts? And this might be a contrived question, just because I know, as I mentioned, I've listened to Masters in Business and a couple others, but do you mostly listen to financial services podcasts, or you do listen to other stuff? What do you like?
So I try to actually listen to podcasts that are a little bit more free ranging and also like not
Nice.
so business focused, just to get a little bit of
Yeah.
balance in my
Just
life.
to disconnect. Yes.
So I love Fly on the Wall about Saturday Night Live, which is Dana Carvey and David Spade. They're hilarious, and they are
They
part
are.
of my generation of SNL casts. So any kind of inside baseball that they have on that podcast, I just eat it up. I love them. So I listen to comedy podcasts, just to get a little bit of balance in my life and have a laugh. This
I was
business
going to
can
say,
be
and
really
some
serious
levity.
and intense. So you gotta laugh.
Absolutely. Life is nothing if we're not laughing. That's a great way to end. Thank you again. I really enjoyed hearing your perspectives and having you on. I think we just barely scratched the surface. As I said, we could go on about various things forever. So, Lananh, thank you so much for being here, and I hope to talk to you again soon.
Thank you, Jesse. Take care.
That's all for today's episode of Searching Smarter. If you found this conversation valuable, be sure to subscribe so you don't miss an episode. Until next time, keep searching smarter.